Well, it's both my honor and my pleasure to host a session today with Professor Jane Whittle from the University of Exeter on behalf of the research area E, Gender and Intersectionality of the Bond Center for Slavery and Dependency Studies tonight. I'll shortly introduce today's speaker to you. Jane Whittle has gained her PhD with a work on the development of agrarian capitalism in England, 1450 to 1580. Both aspects point to her expertise of economic and social history of late medieval and early modern England. With a particular interest, and this makes her so interesting and promising for tonight's session, with particular interest in gender, work, and economic development, household economies, property rights, consumption, and material culture. So since 2008, Jane Whittle is a professor of the University of Exeter in England. To most of us, I think, she is known through her publications, most famously through a book she has edited in 2018 on servants in rural Europe, 1400 to 1900. And that book, I recall, set new standards in how to approach the history of servants and servitude from a comparative and gender-sensitive angle. It provided important case studies, plus a theoretical framework open to new insights that emerged from the case study. And only a year later, she published a reflection, a critique of approaches to domestic work, women work, and the pre-industrial economy in past and present, which again, until today, served as an important entry point into the study of dependent domestic labor of both men and women in regard to what has been termed labor without women's contributions. Only very recently, Professor Whittle has authored two important articles in 2023, obviously. One is Agriculture in a volume co-edited with our former fellow Maria Astell, entitled The Whole Economy, Work and Gender in Early Modern Europe. And this piece is also co-authored by Hilde Sandvik, who is one of our international advisors at the BCDSS. And secondly, Jane Whittle engaged with a comparative history of Europe's labor laws, also published in 2023. And there is definitely to say a lot more about her research. And before I hand over to her, I wish to mention three projects she's currently running or engaged with. One is an ERC advanced grant for project Forms of Labor, Gender, Freedom, and Experience of Work in the Pre-Industrial Economy, which runs until, I think, August this year. And it has an internet link on your website, which I cannot now place in the chat, but it's really worth to look it up. It's Forms of Labor, Exeter AC UK. And secondly, a Lover Home trust-funded project, The Material Culture of Wilts, England 1450 to 1790, which to me as an historian of early modern gender history is of sincere interest, I have to say. And she's also a research partner in a project, Work and Well-Being in History, which I thought is a tremendous project and topic in the face of dependency studies. Now, Professor Jane Whittle will speak today on gender, freedom, and work in early modern Europe. And we are very happy to have you here this evening, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's a great honor to be invited. So I'm really glad I can join you today. So this lecture is about the mechanisms of gender inequality in the early modern economy, the causes behind women's work being low status, low paid, and low skilled. It argues that women's freedoms were constricted in comparison to men's, shaping their economic activities. As Sheila Ogilvie has noted, women have less access to resources because they have less freedom of choice in production and consumption. The history of women's work swings between two extremes. On the one hand, it celebrates women's achievements, working in areas of the economy we would not expect, running businesses, acting with agency and skill, and making up an essential part of the workforce. However, on the other, it relentlessly catalogues women's inferiority, their absence from positions of power, and from many types of work, records their labour force participation as lower than men's, and of course, notes the low status, low paid, and low skilled nature of their work. My argument today is that these two ways of looking at women's work can be reconciled by acknowledging women's economic capability, but also the significant barriers to women's freedom of action. Because women's economic position was inherently contradictory, the lecture is structured around examining a series of these contradictions. These are, firstly, the idea that even wealthy gentlewomen, to quote Mary Astell, were born slaves. The division of roles within the family household that gave women authority while also structuring their subordination. Thirdly, that marriage was the easiest way for women to gain wealth, but also to lose it. Fourth, that good housewifery offered women status, while housework involved the performance of inferiority. Fifth, that working in service gave single women independence, but at the cost of losing many freedoms. And sixth, that casual wage labour was formally free, but very rarely offered women wealth or independence. Examining these contradictions allows us to work towards a more satisfactory explanation for gender inequality in the economy. And I do so in conversation with Sheila Ogilvy's arguments in her groundbreaking book on women's work, A Bitter Living, which studied gendered work in Southwest Germany. Since its publication in 2003, our knowledge of women's work, particularly unpaid work and the work of married women, has been greatly expanded by the adoption of Ogilvy's methodology of examining evidence of work activities rather than just paid work or occupational titles. First in early modern Sweden by Maria Ågren and her team, and more recently by my own research projects on early modern England. In the light of these findings, I now return to the issue that prompted gathering the data, explaining gender inequality in the economy. Ogilvy summarizes the three main types of explanation of gender inequality in the early modern economy as technological, institutional, and cultural, of which she favored the institutional explanation. Technological explanations rest on biological difference and market forces. In particular, they stress women's lesser upper body strength and ability to bear and breastfeed children, and argue that these differences led to women's lower productivity in waged and income generating work, and encouraged specialization in home-based service work, particularly childcare and housework. Institutional explanations stress legal, regulatory, and government structures that created unequal opportunities. For instance, excluding women from certain types of work, enforcing lower wages for women, or denying women legal control of property. Cultural explanations emphasize traditions and customs. Ogilvy is dismissive of cultural explanations. Yet, through the concept of patriarchy, these have formed a major strand of feminist theory. As defined by Sylvia Walby, patriarchy is a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women. Although patriarchy can encompass institutional inequalities, much of what it applies is cultural. The problem with patriarchy as a concept is that it tends to be a label for a set of observations rather than an explanatory model. It describes the inequalities faced by women rather than explaining the causes behind them. It is not adequate to say men seek to oppress women, as our daily experiences of gender inequality show the mechanisms to be far more complicated and to stretch well beyond individual attitudes and actions. As Judith Bennett has observed, there is a remarkable continuity in women's pattern of work over time. The concept of patriarchy does little to explain why this was the case in the face of momentous historical changes, such as the development of capitalism, the expansion of world trade, religious change and political upheaval. Women's inferior economic position had to be constantly remade in the face of these changes. My approach to this problem is multi-stranded. I draw on ideas from a range of historians, economists, and other social scientists. Particularly influential, however, have been Carole Pateman's classic book, The Sexual Contract, published in 1988, and its chapter on wives, slaves, and wage slaves. And also Claudia Goldin's article, A Pollution Theory of Discrimination. Both examine the modern, that is, 19th and 20th century economy, but make observations with powerful implications for other time periods. Pateman's discussion explores women's economic and social position comparatively through the lens of freedom and subordination. As she notes, feminist discussions do not usually consider the similarities and differences between slaves, servants, and workers, and whether the subjection of wives might throw light onto other forms of subordination. In her modeling of economic behavior, Goldin explains male hostility to women entering male-dominated professions, not as a consequence of men's dislike of women or a desire to maintain higher wages, but the fear of losing status. The insight that status is a crucial motivator in economic choices, even in the 20th century, should cause us to look afresh at many historical explanations. In terms of Ogilvy's scheme, my focus on freedom equates with her emphasis on institutions, while the focus on status pushes us towards a more careful consideration of cultural factors. I hope this will become clearer as we progress through the 6 historical examples of the contradictions in women's economic position. In the preface to the 1706 edition of a work titled Some Reflections upon Marriage, the English philosopher and feminist Mary Astell wrote, "If all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? As they must be if the being subjected to the inconsistent, uncertain, unknown, and arbitrary will of men be the perfect condition of slavery." Astell's comments were not a flippant rhetorical device, but a pointed retort to the writings of philosophers such as Hobbes, who failed to acknowledge how women's position differed from men's. As a member of a wealthy merchant family, it's also likely that Astell had some knowledge of slavery in England's colonial plantations in this period. There was clearly a world of difference between the situation of an English gentlewoman and that of enslaved people working in plantations. Gentlewomen did not perform relentless, back-breaking labor or endure living conditions so harsh that they led to early death. Unlike enslaved people, most women entered marriage out of choice. Wives were not normally sold, although there was a form of customary divorce in England which involved the symbolic sale of the wife. Wives retained some control over the pace and organization of their own labor, and wives were not socially dead. But Astell's claim is not without substance, for as Pateman notes, until the late 19th century, the legal and civil position of a wife resembled that of a slave. Under English common law, once a woman married, she ceased to have a legal existence separate from her husband. They were one person, and that person was the husband, a concept known as coverture. As such, a wife could not own wealth or property. Her assets were entirely controlled by the husband. Her household labor was unpaid, and she had no legal right to wages or income that she earned. The husband also controlled his wife's body. A wife could not legally refuse sex with her husband, and the husband could physically punish the wife. Women took their husband's name. Wives had no legal right to determine levels of consumption or place of residence. In the event of separation, they had no right of guardianship over their children, While arrangements for separation could be made in extreme circumstances, women could not leave a marriage. They could not end the marriage contract. The wife's position as the inferior partner in the marriage was not a consequence of choice, but the result of belonging to a group who were considered inferior, that is, women. Pateman highlights the injustice of women's unpaid housework and childcare. Yet in the pre-industrial economy, other economic issues come to the forefront. The loss of control over property was a more significant issue for wealthy women than the provision of unpaid labour. For women of middling wealth, perhaps the biggest difficulty was the control of assets from businesses, which were often run independently from their husbands. For labourers, it was the control of wages and choices about types of work. Housework was not irrelevant, but the employment of servants relieved many wives of some of this labour, while at the same time highlighting the similarity between the wife's position and the servants. However, while it's important to hold in mind the harsh legal underpinnings of women's position in early modern society, particularly within marriage, it's also important to consider how things worked in practice. Wives and daughters shared a standard of living with the husband or father, in a way that slaves and servants did not. The legal position of wives was cruel and often intractable, but at the same time, many women lived prosperously with their husbands without obvious conflict. Given that most women were keen to enter marriage, marriage must have offered something for women other than subjection. The marital household was structured around gendered inequality, but nonetheless offered women the status and authority of being female household head alongside her husband. Thomas Tilney's A Brief and Pleasant Discourse of Duties in Marriage, called The Flower of Friendship, was published in 1569 and dedicated to England's Queen Elizabeth I. It takes the form of a Renaissance dialogue that considers the reasons for marriage and the relationship between the couple. Within it is a passage which describes the respective duties of a husband and wife in managing the household economy. The office of the husband is to bring in the necessaries, of the wife, well to keep them. The office of the husband is to go abroad in matters of profit, of the wife to tarry at home and see all be well there. The office of the husband is to provide money, of the wife not to wastefully spend it. The office of the husband is to deal and bargain with all men, of the wife to make or meddle with no man. The office of the husband is to be lord of all, of the wife to give account of all, and the office of a husband is to maintain well his livelihood, and the office of a woman is to govern well the household. These duties place obligations on husband and wife. The husband is charged with bringing in income, bargaining with other men, and maintaining his livelihood. The wife's role is housebound, tarrying at home and meddling with no man, but involves managing the household economy, not wastefully spending their income, and governing the household. Nonetheless, the division of duties is based on hierarchy. The man is to be lord of all, and the wife is to give account to him of her actions. Similar schemes for the good ordering of households had a long history, stretching back to the work of Xenophon in ancient Greece. This passage itself has a longer history, appearing word for word in Dodd and Cleaver's Godly Form of Household Government, published in 1598, and reprinted in multiple editions into the 17th century. Similar statements appeared in household government books across Northwest Europe. We know from the analysis of work activities that while women did more work around the house than men, work often took them outside and into other people's houses. In early modern England, both genders did the majority of their work outside. Nor did households rely only on men to provide money or livelihood. Many other statements from this period show that women were expected to contribute to household incomes, and most did. Instead, this trite division of roles between husband and wife represents an ideal. It asserted the husband's superiority, sought to confine the role of a wife, and to avoid disagreement in marital decision-making. It was one perspective on an issue rarely adequately resolved in household government books of this period: the tension between joint decision-making and requiring the wife's obedience to the husband. In the second part of The Flower of Friendship, it turns precisely to this issue. Lady Julia argues that in good marriages, wives obey their husbands because God commands it, and we are bound to do so. Lady Isabella, who is thought to represent Queen Elizabeth, questions this, saying that it is just as agreeable that the husband obey the wife as the wife the husband, or at the least that there be no superiority between them. But this is then ridiculed, suggesting that if the man obeyed the wife, he would soon be found sweeping the house and being beaten by his wife. There are some surprising parallels between these early modern debates and the new household economics of the economist Gary Becker. He sought to describe and measure the most economically efficient way of organizing a marital household in 20th century America. Like Tilney, Becker sees advantages in one marriage partner, the man, concentrating on going abroad in matters of profit and bringing in the money, and the other, the woman, tarrying at home and seeing all is well there. Becker argues that it is more economically efficient for one partner to specialize in income generation and the other in what he describes as household production, that is, housework and childcare. Each can concentrate on developing higher human capital in their respective specialisms and gain better results. Because women are biologically determined to have children, it is more efficient for them to take on the wider duties of childcare and specialize in household production. As the husband's specialism results in higher income and the wife's in a more comfortable home, sharing their products results in a higher standard of living for both. We can disagree with Becker's ideas on many levels, but the point here is to note the similarity with Tilney's 16th century scheme for an ideal household. There are other similarities too, not fully acknowledged by Becker, relating to the inequality of the efficient family household. The wife relies on the husband's income and thus is vulnerable to him failing to share the income equally or leaving the partnership. It is the man who accrues status and power through his role in the wider economy, while the woman is seen as dependent and subordinate. Thus, we can question the efficiency of these arrangements for women. In early modern society, the organization of the household along gendered lines was justified as a way to achieve social order rather than efficiency. It was openly acknowledged that the arrangement relied on women accepting a subordinate position in the partnership and obeying her husband. The historian Linda Pollock, in her article, Teach Her to Live Under Obedience, explores elite women's education and household roles in early modern England. Women were expected to be capable. They were educated to be literate, skilled in medical care and cookery, to oversee large households, including a staff of servants, and keep household accounts to manage household finances and consumption. Women also ran farms and managed estates. Many women exercised this work with ability and skill, yet they could only do this with the support and permission of their husband or other male relatives. The duty of obedience or subordination overrode all other household roles within marriage. Marriage could be economically enabling or disastrous for women. A trail of probate documents trace the fortunes of a woman named Joanna Dyer, who married Nicholas Pay in Minster in Thanet on the Thames estuary in 1675. Nicholas died in 1681, and his probate inventory shows him to have been a wealthy farmer and shopkeeper. The inventory was valued at £279, including shop goods worth £69 and agricultural assets worth £122. This wealth passed to Joanna, who quickly married again. At the time of her second marriage, she described herself as a widow and possessed of and entitled unto diverse goods, chattels, ready money, debts, household stuff, and shop goods to the value of £400. Her second husband, Nicholas Ridgeon, signed a premarital agreement that did covenant, grant, and promise that he would not at any time during their coverture give or sell away, alter, exchange, or divest her goods and money. When Nicholas Ridgeon died 4 years later, the same large farm and shop are in evidence. However, when she filed his probate account, Joanna complained that Ridgeon had been heavily indebted when he died. He owed £251 in rent for the farm and £233 to 5 different London suppliers for shop goods. Despite their premarital agreement, after paying his debts and costs, Joanna was left with only £22. She lived for another 9 years, dying in 1694. Her inventory records her occupation as shopkeeper and showed that she was still running a farm. She had recouped her losses and, despite scaling back the enterprise somewhat, still died a prosperous woman. Her shop goods were worth only £3, but she had £29 worth of corn in her barn and livestock valued at £83. She had invested £25 in the share of a boat, possibly one of the many that plied the coastal trade carrying grain from Thanet to London. In total, her goods and investments were worth just over £200. Joanna was clearly a capable woman, able to run a successful farm and shop without a husband during the 9 years of her widowhood and recoup the losses resulting from her second husband's actions. We do not know what wealth she brought into her first marriage. It's likely she had a significant dowry, which contributed to the establishment of a farm and shop in her first marriage. Given Joanna's success during widowhood, there's no reason to assume these businesses belong to her husbands, rather than being the achievement of a married couple. Had she not married, she would have been unlikely to set up these businesses and achieve this level of wealth on her own. It was very rare for never married women to run large farms. Shopkeeping was a more common female occupation, but shops run by lone women were smaller and less well stocked. The danger of a woman marrying and thus being subject to coverture made it difficult for single women to contract large loans, an essential part of any retail business. Joanna gained economic prosperity through her first marriage, but almost lost it completely through her second. In their study of gender and work in early modern Sweden, Maria Ågren and her co-authors conclude that, while sometimes highly problematic, marriage nevertheless offered an early modern woman the best position both economically and socially, and that marriage created a position of status and power for both spouses. They stress the importance of women's contribution, describing marriage as an economic partnership that can be understood as the two-supporter model, as opposed to the man being solely responsible for making a living. Unlike the ideal models proposed by Thomas Tilney and Gary Becker, in early modern Sweden, both wife and husband contributed to household income through their work activities. Wives either assisted their husbands or carried on a separate business. Unlike the dependent housewife of the 20th century, early modern wives found that marriage opened up a wider range of income-earning opportunities. This is demonstrated by comparing the types of work tasks undertaken by never married women and those undertaken by women who were or had been married. In Sweden, unmarried women did more agriculture, transport, and unspecified work, which was often service, while married women were more involved in administration, management, and buying and selling. Sheila Ogilvy drew similar conclusions from her study of Southwest Germany. Their guild regulations excluded unmarried women from many forms of work, but marriage to a guild member gave women access. Similar findings are repeated for early modern England. Housework and transport were a larger proportion of young unmarried women's work repertoires than that of married women. Instead, married women did more tasks but required judgment and responsibility, such as commerce and management. When married women did carry out housework, it was often on a commercial basis, for instance, as part of running an alehouse. Marriage brought more varied and skilled work and the ability to direct the work of others. So while married women were subordinated to their husbands, marriage increased their status among women and placed them in the social hierarchy, below their husbands, but above less wealthy men. Thus, the wife of a farmer had more status than the wife of a labourer. Yet marriage also came at a cost to women's basic freedoms. She might be her husband's economic partner, but in law, the partnership was represented only by the man. If the husband was incompetent or unable to support his family, the wife could work to generate income, but only with her husband's permission and at the risk of the husband removing all wages or profits from her control at any time. Thus, for women, marriage was a gamble in which many women won, but others lost heavily. Women's work within the household could bring recognition and status, but can also be seen as the performance of inferiority. In 1593, Robert Furze, a wealthy Devon farmer, wrote a family memoir that included the histories of over 100 of his relatives, women as well as men. Some of these women he held in particular esteem, including Joan Rowland, his wife's mother. Like Joanna Dyer, Joan Rowland made an unsuccessful second marriage. After her first husband died in 1560, she married a minor gentleman who, according to Furze, quarrelled with her, forsook her company, misused her, and put her in great danger of her life, sold her land, and took property of her goods. She obtained a legal separation and spent the rest of her life circulating between the households of her married children, including that of Robert Furze, dependent on their charity for her survival. Yet despite this, Furze described Joan Rowland as a wise woman, an excellent good housewife, and careful, a perfect woman to do anything with her needle, to knit and to make bone lace. She was a fine cook and well esteemed of all people. She was a pleasant woman in company and was ever of honest life and good conversation. The judgment that Joan was an excellent good housewife, therefore, was not a reflection of her role within marriage, but an acknowledgement of her work skills. Being a good housewife was a work role that gained women respect and status. Garfield Walker has demonstrated that women use a reputation as a good housewife to defend themselves against defamation in the courts. Men such as Robert Furze thought it was an important asset and one that not all women possess. Good housewifery was both a set of tasks and an approach to household management. Numerous practical advice books addressed to housewives, printed in England between 1570 and 1750, list the tasks involved in housewifery by offering advice. Most commonly, these related to cookery, preparing medicines, and preserving foodstuffs. But it also often extended to tasks such as gardening, keeping pigs and poultry, raising calves, caring for dairy cattle, making butter and cheese, brewing, baking bread, processing wool and flax, and distilling. As such, housewifery was the female equivalent of husbandry. Together, the husband and housewife had the skills needed to run a farm. In addition, housewifery had a strong association with thrift, the avoidance of waste and the careful management of resources. It was in pursuit of this goal that work skills were acquired and performed. It was assumed that the good housewife would oversee others, training and directing daughters and female servants in their work. As such, the role offered women status, authority, and recognition for skilled work. While most good housewives were married, it was taking charge of running a household and exercising work skills that defined the role. Housewifery was not the same as housework, although the two are sometimes confused by historians. Housework was also dominated by women. If we define housework as cleaning, laundry, and the provision of meals and other domestic amenities, the study of English early modern work tasks shows that women did 86% of this work. When men did perform housework, it was because they were servants, because it was part of a business, for instance, running an alehouse, or in extraordinary circumstances. It is often argued that women did housework because it was easily compatible with childcare, which required women to be around the home while men were absent working elsewhere. Closer examination of housework tasks undermines this assumption. First, over a third, that's 37% of housework tasks took place outside the house. Second, work such as cooking on an open fire and doing laundry were not safely compatible with caring for small children, as cases of accidental death demonstrate. Thirdly, other tasks such as serving meals, lighting fires, or fetching lights were performed when men were present. The gendering of housework requires a more careful explanation. The fetching of light and fire is a telling example. This was a common early modern task. Fetching light often meant going to another part of the house or even to a neighbour to light a candle. Work tasks recorded in court documents reveal that this was not done by male householders. Men asked or ordered their wives or servants to fetch lights. Indeed, men seem to have preferred to sit and wait in the dark rather than fetching light themselves. This suggests that who did some forms of housework had more to do with the performance of status than convenience or efficiency. The low status of housework is emphasized in a court case from the 1650s, in which Elizabeth Richards, an unmarried gentlewoman living in her brother's household, accused her brother of mistreating her. His actions included kicking and striking her, threatening her with a brass candlestick, throwing a key and a clog at her, calling her an ugly creature, and commanding her to wash the dishes. In his defense, he said he only but once commanded her to wash the dishes. Clearly, both understood that washing dishes was not an appropriate activity for a gentlewoman. It diminished her status. In an article on the pollution theory of discrimination, the economist Claudia Goldin examines the mechanisms behind gendered occupational segregation in 20th century America. She argues that men's hostility to women entering male-dominated occupations was the consequence of a desire by men to maintain their occupational status or prestige, distinct from the desire to maintain their earnings. If more women entered an occupation, it was taken as a sign that the status of that occupation was declining. Similarly, we might infer that men resisted doing types of work which were numerically dominated by women, such as housework, because it reduced men's status and authority within the wider community. Goldin's insight here is that work can be about performing status just as much as maximizing income or allocating tasks efficiently to those with appropriate skills. Adopting this perspective, we can see doing housework as the performance of inferiority and ordering others to do it as a mark of authority. This, it seems, is the main reason why housework was done by women and servants. It both reflected and reinforced their status in the household. Working as a servant offered single women freedom and independence from their family of birth at the expense of subordination and vulnerability elsewhere. In his autobiography, Adam Martindale tells the story of how his older sister, Jane, left their home in Prescott, Lancashire, and travelled 200 miles to London to find work in the 1620s. Her parents, who were moderately wealthy, did not want her to go. As Martindale wrote, she wanted nothing at home, nor was likely to lack anything, and if she had mind to be married, her father was then in a good ordinary capacity to prefer her, that is, to pay her dowry. In addition, she had no friends in London to go to, and her family feared that for her health in a city that was just emerging from a plague epidemic. But Jane, having her father's spirit and her mother's beauty, no persuasion would serve, but up she would to serve a lady, as she hoped to do, being ingenious with her needle. Jane was able to persuade her parents to let her make this extraordinary journey because she hoped to find and secure respectable employment in London as a servant. Service offered unmarried women a reason to leave home and travel and a means of supporting themselves. For young unmarried people, service was a viable alternative to marriage. Because employment came with the provision of food and lodgings, and contracts typically lasted a year, service provided security and respectability, and the respectability of being subsumed within an existing household. It was the only form of employment that was just as open to women as men. Although the types of work undertaken varied by gender. Service provided an opportunity to acquire skills, earn an income, and make savings before setting up an independent household and marriage. But service was not free wage labour in the way envisaged by most economists. It came with an expectation, and indeed a legal underpinning, of servility. While servants might negotiate wages and length of contract, once within service, they had no fixed work hours, little say over what work they did, and became the legal dependents of their employer. They could not leave before the end of a contract and were liable to physical punishment. The enforcement of the terms of service were the most frequently used element of the labour laws. The English government and male community leaders saw service as a way to control young men and particularly young women. As such, service displays many of the same characteristics as marriage for women. It was typically, although not always, freely entered, and terms could be negotiated beforehand. But once entered, the servant or wife was at the mercy of her employer or husband's goodwill. Parallels have also been drawn between the work roles of wives and servants. As Carole Pateman writes, the labour of the housewife is aptly termed domestic servitude, or more politely, domestic service. And at the time Pateman was writing in the late 1980s, both types of labour were generally regarded by historians and others as not really work being located in the men's work of capitalism and workplaces. Historians such as Tina de Moore and Jan Luton van Zanden have emphasized the freedom and agency work as a servant brought to early modern women. But it is important not to overlook the essential civility of this type of work. Casual day labouring was unequivocally free, but failed to offer women a means of supporting themselves. In 1541, Alice Miggle, a married woman, did 135 days of wage labour for Wollerton Estate, just outside Nottingham in England's North Midlands. That year, she worked more days for wages than her husband, John Miggle, and earned similar day wages. 2p in the winter, 2.5p for making hay, and 3p in the harvest. Although she found some work outside the summer, winnowing corn, spreading manure, weeding, and helping with thatcher, most of her work was concentrated in the hay and corn harvest of July to September. Her total earnings at Wollerton in 1541 were £1, 5 shillings and 8 pence, which would have been insufficient to support herself without further sources of income. Men were typically paid more than women in the early modern economy. The wage series compiled by Jane Humphreys and Jacob Weisdorf showed that average women's wages were between 1/3 and 2/3 of men's. Joyce Burnett, who found a similar gap between women's and men's wages during the Industrial Revolution, argues that this was caused by two main factors. First, women's lesser upper body strength in forms of work that relied on muscle power. And secondly, the fact that women worked slightly shorter hours than men. In their study of early modern wages in Portugal, Nuno Palma and his co-authors found that women's wages were 2/3 of men's, and argued that this did not represent discrimination, but really merely reflected the average difference in physical strength between men and women. Yet neither of these factors has universal application. There's no evidence of women working shorter hours before the 1790s, when men's working hours became unusually long. And if women's strength was on average 2/3 of men's, why did the gender wage gap vary so much over time and between regions? An increasing number of studies have observed women and men receiving equal pay for certain tasks in the early modern economy. Elise van Nederveen-Meerkerk found female and male workers receiving equal pay when spinning the same type of yarn in the 17th century Dutch Republic, while Catherine Gary shows that female building labourers in early modern Sweden received the same rates of pay to men in certain periods. My own research on English agriculture between 1480 and 1680 shows that women and men often, but not always, receive the same daily wages for tasks such as weeding crops, making hay, and harvesting corn with a sickle, as was the case on the Wollerton estate where Alice Miguel worked. Yet receiving the same daily wage for some tasks did not mean that women earned the same as men on average. There were many tasks that women were not employed to undertake. At harvest time, the best paid task was mowing hay or crops with a scythe. At Wollerton, a mixed workforce received 3 pence a day for harvesting crops with a sickle, but men received twice that amount, 6 pence, for mowing with a scythe. Other tasks in which women were not employed included carting, threshing, ploughing, cutting wood, and hedging and ditching. The wider range of tasks undertaken by men enabled them to find employment all year round. In contrast, women's day labour in agriculture was concentrated in July to September. Out of almost 7,000 days of wage labour undertaken by women in 14 sets of accounts, 73% of women's work fell in these 3 months, and only 6% in the winter between January and March. Women were not incapable of doing the tasks given to men. English court depositions record women occasionally threshing corn, ploughing, and driving carts. Elsewhere in Europe, such as Norway and Russia, threshing, digging, and ploughing were commonly done by women. The owners of large English farms that relied on wage labour did not employ women to do these tasks. Economic development involves increased reliance on wage labour over time. Development economists such as Amartya Sen stress the freedom that wage earning provides for women. Via possession of their own income, women have more say in household spending decisions, and the availability of paid work provides an incentive to have fewer children and invest more in those children's upbringings. De Moor and Van Sanden transferred some of these ideas to Europe between the 14th and 18th centuries. They argue that increased wage earning by women after the Black Death boosted the economy of Northwest Europe by expanding the wage labour force, giving women more independence and suppressing demographic growth. Yet was wage earning really a source of freedom for women in the early modern economy? For women such as Alice Smiggle, wage earning was a low status, physically demanding and insecure form of employment. There was insufficient work available to allow a woman to support herself in this way. Changes in the gender balance of agricultural day labour over time suggest that such work did not give women a greater say in household decision-making. Female day labourers acted as a reserve army of labour. Female day labourers acted as a reserve army of labour. They entered the workforce at times of the year and in periods when insufficient male labour was available. They were squeezed out of the labour market at other times. In these periods, just when households were most in need of women's income, it was male labour that was prioritised. Thus, for instance, women provided 39% of the days worked as casual agricultural labourers in the late 15th and 16th centuries, but only 17% in the 17th century when landlessness and wage labour increased. Ogilvy follows Becker in explaining this pattern as a consequence of women's superior productivity in the household and inferior productivity in income-earning work in comparison to men. But we can also explain it as a result of unequal bargaining in the household. Men's work was prioritised. Thus, while casual day labour required none of the civility inherent in service, it lacked security and did not free women from the inequalities of household power relations. As Pateman argues, gender inequalities in paid work are illuminated by the structure of domestic relations, and the patriarchal division of labour in the conjugal home shapes women's participation in wage labour. So in conclusion, we've seen that women played an active role in the early modern economy and did not always fare badly. They shared a standard of living with their male relatives, and as married women had some control over organising activities. Wives shared responsibility for running the marital household, including production activities, with their husband, and exercised authority over servants and children. Marriage presented more economic opportunities than were available to single women, particularly in running businesses and engaging in commerce. Housewifery, as a form of women's work, brought recognition and status. The possibility of entering service allowed young women to break free from their parental household, acquiring new skills and accumulating income. Women were employed as day labourers and sometimes paid the same daily wage or piece rate as men. But to focus on these positive aspects of women's economic position is to overlook the disabilities women faced in comparison to men. Women's legal position within marriage shared similarities with aspects of slavery. Household responsibilities were structured around the wife's subordination to her husband and her ultimate duty to obey his decisions. While marriage opened up economic opportunities for women, it also involved a high level of economic risk. All a wife's earnings, profits, and accumulated wealth were controlled by the husband, and he had no obligations to leave her anything after his death. Women did the great majority of housework, not because it was convenient for them to do so, but because it was a dishonourable form of work that men avoided in order to protect their own status. Outside marriage, service was an inherently servile form of work that involved loss of control over time and work tasks, and a lack of protection from the employer's actions. Day labouring rarely offered women a viable way to make a living, and long-term patterns of women's employment show that women's opportunities were shaped by male priorities rather than women's need for wages. Men's dominance in household decisions shaped women's participation in paid work. Ogilvy outlined 3 types of explanation for women's position in the economy: the technological, or what we might describe as biological and market-driven, the institutional, which was shaped by laws and regulations, and the cultural, such as patriarchy and custom. I agree with Ogilvy's criticisms of technological explanations and would even take these criticisms further. The patterns of women's work and pay had little to do with biological differences, and men and women did not compete for work on an equal basis in a perfect market. The consequences of men's greater upper body strength and women's childbearing on patterns of work were minimal. Instead, Ogilvy points to institutional limitations on women's economic activities. These were greater in Southwest Germany than in England, but nonetheless, English laws of coverture, inheritance, and probate all undermined women's economic position, while the labour laws reinforced inequality in service and casual wage labour. Ogilvy is dismissive of cultural explanations, observing that it is not evident that cultural attitudes would have had much impact without community and state institutions to give them practical expression. Here, I disagree strongly. As Carole Pateman argues, women's participation in the wider economy was shaped by their position within the family household. The removal of many legal inequalities in the 20th century has revealed the power of slow-moving cultural attitudes in maintaining gender inequality in the absence of formal legal structures. Families and informal communities have extensive influence in enforcing accepted norms. In early modern society, these norms were even stronger, and inequality was located in the household and in the maintenance of women's inferior status within wider society, as well as in the legal structures that inhibited women's freedom action. Thank you.